The sun rises over Tokyo Bay as 91 P-51D Mustangs close in on their rendezvous point. Major James B. Tapp sits in his cockpit, hands steady on the controls, 6 heavy machine guns loaded and ready. These early Mustangs carry nearly 3,000 rounds total. Later models would sacrifice ammunition capacity for mechanical refinement, dropping to under 2,000 rounds. Below, Mount Fuji's snow-covered summit pierces the morning sky, serving as the navigation marker pilots have been briefed to watch for. Sunlight spreads across the countryside, illuminating rice paddies, villages, and military compounds that have never witnessed American single-engine fighters this deep into Japan's homeland. The mission itself defies conventional wisdom. These planes have traveled 750 miles from their island base, a feat military strategists had declared impossible for single-engine aircraft just 2 years prior. Shortly after 7 in the morning, over 100 Japanese interceptors rise to meet the American formation. Through the haze, Japanese pilots confront an impossible sight: land-based American fighters circling over their capital city. Their commanders had promised this could never happen. The psychological blow is immediate and crushing. These aren't carrier-based Navy fighters with limited fuel. These are Army Air Force machines that have somehow crossed 750 miles of open water to appear above the Imperial Palace itself. Japan's defenders fly a mixed force: the advanced K-84 Hayate fighters, older Hayabusa and Shoki models, plus various Navy types, including Zeros and the newer Shiden variants. The K-84 could outperform both the Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt under specific conditions, but today's engagement will expose the vast chasm between two nations' approaches to modern air warfare. The P-51D Mustang arrived in the Pacific with a reputation forged over Europe, where it had shattered the Luftwaffe and enabled daylight bombing campaigns deep into Germany. Originally designed for British export, these aircraft were transformed when fitted with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, a perfect marriage of American aerodynamic design and British power plant engineering. The Packard-built Merlin engine produces nearly 1,700 horsepower at takeoff, climbing to over 1,720 in emergency settings. Its 2-stage supercharger maintains sea-level power at altitudes where Japanese engines suffocate. The first compression stage feeds cooled air to a second stage, delivering oxygen-rich mixture to the cylinders even at extreme altitude. This aircraft cruises at 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, reaches operational ceilings above 40,000 feet, and delivers devastating firepower through 6 wing-mounted 50s. Those machine guns fire 80 rounds per second combined, each projectile capable of penetrating armor, igniting fuel, and destroying engines with minimal hits. By late 1944, 14 of 15 fighter squadrons in the European theater flew Mustangs exclusively. This concentration reflected both the aircraft's superiority and American production capacity running at maximum output. Factories operating around the clock, completing 1 new Mustang every hour at peak efficiency. Over 15,000 P-51s would roll off assembly lines before war's end, with the D model alone accounting for more than 8,000 aircraft. That exceeded Japan's total fighter production for the war's final 2 years combined. The truly revolutionary capability bringing Mustangs to Tokyo is their unprecedented operational radius. With twin drop tanks, these fighters routinely fly round trips of 1,500 miles, equivalent to crossing from Los Angeles to the Arkansas border entirely over water in a single-engine aircraft with no alternate landing sites. This achievement stems from the Merlin's exceptional fuel economy at cruise power, consuming just 65 gallons per hour, combined with the P-51's laminar flow wing that reduces drag by 35% compared to conventional designs. That wing maintains smooth airflow over most of its surface,
delaying turbulence and dramatically cutting parasitic resistance. Standing in stark contrast is the K-84 Hayate, which entered service in June 1944, too late and in insufficient numbers to alter the war's trajectory. Named Gale and coded Frank by Allied intelligence, this fighter represented Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological advancement with dwindling resources. The K-84 appears competitive on paper, perhaps even superior in some categories. Its armament includes up to 4 cannons, delivering tremendous striking power. The Nakajima radial engine theoretically produces 2,000 horsepower at takeoff using water methanol injection. Early testing showed promise, with prototypes reaching nearly 400 miles per hour and optimistic claims suggesting speeds beyond 420 under ideal conditions. But late-war Japanese production tells a darker story of collapsing quality control, desperate improvisation, and systemic failure. Field crews quickly learned the Hayate's high-maintenance engine required constant attention, while landing gear failures occurred with alarming frequency. The engine demanded precise manufacturing tolerances that Japanese factories, under constant bombing and lacking quality materials, could no longer maintain. Poor heat treatment of inferior steel meant many landing struts collapsed on touchdown, destroying irreplaceable aircraft and killing pilots who'd taken months to train. While American factories maintained consistent standards despite massive output volumes, Japanese manufacturing deteriorated catastrophically. By 1945, only 3,500 K-84s had been built total, and many sat grounded for lack of parts, fuel, or trained pilots. Of those nominally operational, perhaps half could be considered combat-ready at any moment. The fuel situation alone revealed Japan's strategic catastrophe. American pilots flew on 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from Texas and California refineries, fuel specifically formulated for high-performance engines. Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be synthesized domestically from coal. Late-war Japanese aviation fuel often tested at 87 octane or lower, robbing engines of power and causing destructive pre-ignition. Desperate units attempted supplementing fuel with pine root oil, distilled alcohol from sweet potatoes, even sake byproducts, further degrading performance and reliability. Pilots reported engines that barely started, ran rough at all power settings, and frequently failed catastrophically mid-flight. The gap between theoretical capability and operational reality had become an unbridgeable chasm. On that April morning, the Mustangs formed up with their charges, over 100 B-29 superfortresses carrying tons of incendiary bombs. One pilot recalled the spectacle, the bombers finishing their assembly circle as the fighters arrived, sunlight gleaming off aluminum skin like a school of giant silver fish. The rendezvous itself demonstrated navigation precision that would have been impossible without American technological advantages. The Mustangs had crossed 750 miles of featureless ocean using dead reckoning and basic radio compass, timing their arrival within minutes of the bomber's schedule. Crossing the coastline, pilots jettisoned their external tanks as they spotted the first interceptors scrambling from airfields around Tokyo. Those silver tanks tumbled earthward, glinting in morning sun, exploding on impact, or bouncing across rice paddies. Japanese pilots experienced immediate shock. These weren't limited-range Navy fighters. These were Army Air Force machines that had somehow crossed 750 miles of open water to appear above the Imperial Palace itself. One sergeant flying a K-84 later recalled his disbelief. Our commanders had assured us no American fighter could reach Japan. Yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our sky. In that moment, I knew the war was truly lost.
Major Tapp tore into a Japanese formation, later describing the engagement with clinical precision. The enemy came in traditional three-plane formations, but coordination was poor. Flight leaders would commit to attacks while wingmen failed to follow through. hesitant, perhaps conserving ammunition or simply inexperienced. The Mustangs dove through them with 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, then zoom climbed back to altitude before the Japanese could react. This tactical breakdown reflected a training crisis that had reached catastrophic proportions. By 1945, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, killed over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacements received as little as 50 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat, compared to 600 hours American pilots received before deployment. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to base, they were credited with 26 enemy aircraft destroyed, at the cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. That 13-to-1 kill ratio would only improve as American pilots gained experience, and Japanese pilot quality continued deteriorating. Within weeks, ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 would become routine. The performance differential became starkly apparent in combat, particularly at altitude where most interceptions occurred. The P-51D's superiority shone above 20,000 feet, where the Merlin's two-stage supercharger maintained sea-level power, while Japanese engines struggled for oxygen. The K-84's single-stage supercharger caused power to drop dramatically above 20,000 feet, precisely where most combat took place. At 30,000 feet, the Hayate barely managed 350 miles per hour, while the Mustang still achieved 420. One lieutenant described typical engagements: spotting Japanese fighters climbing to meet them, leaving dark exhaust trails as they firewalled throttles. But by 25,000 feet, they were wallowing like fish out of water, engines smoking from running too rich because superchargers couldn't compress enough air. The Mustangs would dive through formations with machine guns blazing, then zoom climb back to altitude, Merlin engines singing while Japanese radials coughed and sputtered. The P-51D could dive approaching 500 miles per hour while maintaining control, whereas Japanese fighters often experienced control reversal or structural failure above 400 in a dive. The contrast in pilot quality was devastating and worsened daily. American pilots arriving at base typically had 400 to 600 hours total time, including extensive gunnery practice, combat training against experienced instructors, and formation flying drilled until it became second nature. Japanese pilots in 1945 often had under 100 hours total time, sometimes as little as 30, with minimal gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages, no instrument training, and combat tactics learned from manuals rather than living instructors. The navigation challenge alone separated the capable from the doomed. Flying single-engine fighters on 1,500-mile ocean crossings with minimal navigational aids required competence, born of experience, and trust in both machine and support systems. American pilots flew with detailed weather briefings, accurate maps, functioning instruments, rescue submarines stationed along their route, and Dumbo flying boats standing by. Japanese pilots increasingly flew with outdated maps, unreliable compasses, and no hope of rescue if forced down at sea. Behind each force stood vastly different support infrastructures. Every mission from base involved nearly 100 Mustangs, consuming 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carrying 230,000 rounds of ammunition. This represented just one day's operations from one base, and 3 fighter groups operated from that island alone. Supporting this effort was a supply chain stretching to Detroit factories, Texas refineries, and Missouri ammunition plants, all connected by Liberty ships produced at 3 per day, and cargo aircraft flying regular Pacific routes. Ships arrived daily with fuel, ammunition, parts, food, mail, everything needed to keep a modern Air Force operational. Japanese logistics had collapsed into chaos. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled, leaving new pilots to face combat with no recent flying experience. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions. The Navy and Air Army forces competed desperately for dwindling resources like starving animals. Aircraft were cannibalized for parts until nothing remained but aluminum skeletons. Entire fighter groups sat grounded for lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some units attempted manufacturing their own spare parts with predictably disastrous results. June 1, 1945, proved that even American technology had limits. About 150 Mustangs bound for Osaka flew into a blinding frontal system that weather forecasts had missed. 27 aircraft were lost in minutes, 24 due to weather alone. Pilots became disoriented in towering cumulus clouds, collided with each other, or simply ran out of fuel searching for clear air. The weather front extended from sea level to 40,000 feet with violent turbulence, icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported electrical fire dancing on their wings, compasses spinning uselessly, gyroscopic instruments tumbling as they gave up making sense of the violent motion. Even for the technologically superior Americans, these extreme-range missions pushed men and machines to absolute limits. The impact on Japanese morale was catastrophic and irreversible. One K-84 pilot wrote in his diary, "The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo has shattered our confidence completely. We were told B-29s were vulnerable without escort, that enemy fighters could never reach so far. Now we see Mustangs over the palace itself, strafing our airfields in daylight, shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners." As Major Tapp later reflected, the very long-range missions tested every aspect of flying skill. Combat caused adrenaline to flow, but getting from point to point was the hardest part. The ocean was endless, featureless, hypnotic. Pilots constantly questioned their compass readings, wondering if they had somehow gotten turned around. The physical and mental strain was enormous. Pilots stayed strapped in their cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, unable to stretch, dealing with cramping legs, numbed bodies, and constant anxiety of flying a single engine over vast, empty ocean, where one mechanical failure meant almost certain death. The Mustang's cockpit ergonomics proved superior to Japanese designs in every measurable way. The bubble canopy provided 360 visibility. Pilots could actually look behind them by turning their heads, a life-saving capability. The seat adjusted for different heights. Rudder pedals moved to accommodate leg lengths, and controls were positioned for minimum fatigue. The instrument panel was logically arranged with critical gauges directly in the pilot's line of sight. The K-84's cockpit, while improved over earlier designs, still suffered from poor rear visibility, awkwardly placed controls requiring pilots to remove their hands from the stick at critical moments, and instruments difficult to read under combat conditions. The P-51D's 50 caliber machine guns offered crucial advantages that combat experience had proven decisive. The American guns were extraordinarily reliable, with stoppage rates below 1%. They carried far more ammunition, nearly 2,000 rounds total versus the K-84's 400 rounds for all weapons combined. This meant American pilots could take ranging shots, engage multiple targets, and never worry about running dry after seconds of firing. The ballistics were so well understood that pilots could reliably engage at 400 yards, while Japanese pilots with mixed cannon and machine gun armament struggled with convergence zones and different ballistic trajectories.
The training differential in gunnery was even more pronounced. American pilots had fired thousands of practice rounds, learning to lead targets and estimate range until deflection shooting became instinctive. Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds in training. Many entered first combat having never fired their guns at all. The last aerial combat occurred near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, when American fighters claimed 7 kills in what would become one of the war's final air battles. By this point, Japanese resistance had become almost token, a shadow of the force that once swept across the Pacific. Fuel shortages meant most Japanese fighters sat grounded, their tanks drained to provide fuel for kamikaze aircraft. Those that did fly were often piloted by teenagers with minimal training, boys who'd been in high school just months before. In total, the island-based Mustangs were credited with over 200 Japanese aircraft destroyed between April and August 1945, 75% of all Pacific P-51 victories. The actual number was likely higher, as many aircraft shot down over Japan were never confirmed. The strategic consequences extended far beyond aerial victories. The presence of P-51s over Japan meant B-29s could bomb in daylight with greater accuracy, systematically destroying industrial infrastructure. Japanese production, already crippled by material shortages, ground to a halt under precision daylight bombing. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Japanese civilians could see American fighters strafing airfields in broad daylight, attacking trains, hitting shipping in Tokyo Bay, making clear that Japan had lost control of its own airspace. One reconnaissance pilot recalled flying over airfields intelligence said had hundreds of aircraft, finding maybe a dozen flyable planes. The rest were derelicts, no engines, no propellers, just shells cannibalized for parts. Some airfields featured fake wooden aircraft with painted markings, trying to draw attacks away from real planes hidden under camouflage. The numbers were irrefutable. The United States produced over 15,000 P-51s during the war, more than Japan's total aircraft production of all types in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan managed approximately 3,500 K-84s, but many were destroyed on the ground, lost in training accidents, or grounded for lack of parts. North American aviation alone produced 20 P-51s per day at peak output, more than Japan-built K-84s in a month. Each American aircraft was essentially identical with interchangeable parts, while Japanese aircraft varied wildly in quality even within the same production batch. One K-84 might reach 400 miles per hour, while another from the same factory struggled to exceed 350. Brigadier General Ernest Moore, commander of fighter operations, would later declare there was no question about the P-51 being the best propeller fighter of World War II. This assessment reflected not just performance, but reliability, maintainability, and adaptability to extreme operational demands. The P-51 could be refueled and rearmed in 30 minutes, fly twice daily if needed, and operate from rough coral runways. Maintenance statistics were telling. P-51Ds maintained operational rates above 80% despite harsh conditions. Ground crews could swap engines in 4 hours, and battle damage that would ground Japanese fighters for weeks could be repaired overnight using prefabricated parts. The K-84, even when fuel and ammunition were available, suffered serviceability rates below 40%, sometimes as low as 20%. The complex engine required specialized tools that often didn't exist, trained technicians who were mostly dead or drafted, and spare parts that had to be hand-fitted because manufacturing tolerances were so poor. On August 14th, August 15th in Japan, Lieutenant Jerry Yellen flew what would become the war's last combat mission. Taking off with his 19-year-old wingman, they attacked airfields near Nagoya. The mission had been planned before surrender word reached the base, and the recall code never reached their radios. They strafed their targets and turned for home, banking into cloud cover to escape anti-aircraft fire. When he emerged, his wingman was gone, shot down to become the last American combat death of World War II. Even with the Emperor having already recorded his surrender broadcast, Japanese positions continued firing with desperate determination. Notably absent were Japanese fighters. They had essentially ceased to exist as an effective force, grounded by lack of fuel, lack of pilots, or simply destroyed. The mathematics of the air war were final and irrefutable. The P-51D Mustang, with its 440 top speed, 2,000-mile range with drop tanks, and 6 reliable machine guns with nearly 2,000 rounds, had rendered Japanese home islands defenseless against Gay-light attack. The K-84 Hayate, despite theoretical capabilities and pilot courage, never had the numbers, reliability, or pilot quality to mount effective defense. This wasn't a contest between equals, but a foregone conclusion, the result determined by factories in Detroit and oil wells in Texas as much as combat over Tokyo. American industrial might, expressed through the magnificent Mustang, had achieved what naval blockade and island hopping alone could not: the complete elimination of Japan's ability to defend its airspace. The B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without fighter escort, not because none was available, but because none was needed. Japanese fighter opposition had been swept from the skies, crushed by overwhelming superiority in technology, training, and production. Of 3,500 K-84s built, only one survives today in a museum in Kagoshima, a solitary reminder of Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological supremacy. Meanwhile, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs survive worldwide, many still flying at air shows, the Merlin engines singing the song of American industrial triumph 70 years after they first appeared over Tokyo. The disparity in surviving aircraft tells its own story. American aircraft were built to last, maintained with care, valued as historical artifacts. Japanese aircraft were built for immediate use, expected to be destroyed in combat, treated as expendable. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots encountering Mustangs over Tokyo was more than tactical surprise. It was the stunning realization that American industrial capacity had made the impossible routine. Single-engine fighters flying 1,500-mile combat missions, arriving with fuel to fight for hours and returning safely to base.
The P-51D Mustang over Mount Fuji was not merely an aircraft. It was the embodiment of American industrial supremacy, technological innovation, and the inexorable mathematics of total war. The lesson was clear and brutal. In modern industrial warfare, superior technology multiplied by massive production equals victory. The P-51D represented American industry at its peak. 15,000 aircraft produced with consistent quality, flown by well-trained pilots, supported by unlimited logistics, deployed with strategic precision. Against this, Japan's K-84 Hayate, despite individual courage and occasional tactical success, stood no chance. The shock of American fighters over Tokyo was ultimately the shock of mathematical reality, a reality that ended with atomic bombs delivered by B-29s that no longer needed escort because Japanese air power had ceased to exist. The Mustangs had proven that distance was no defense, that industrial might trumped warrior spirit, that technological superiority properly applied was insurmountable. Japanese pilots learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Courage alone cannot overcome the mathematics of industrial production, technological advancement, and logistical supremacy. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo proved the age of the samurai had ended, replaced by the age of the production line, the supercharger, and the very long-range fighter escort. The divine wind had been conquered by science, the warrior spirit broken by industrial might, and the empire of the rising sun overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.